They emerged from the realm of demons. Out of these shadowy forests, famed for man-eating supermen and celestial nymphs, arrived the Silent Ones, clad in the elements. Earth and ash dusted their skin. Wind swept across their bare bodies. The flame of Agni graced their saffron garments. They were said to have ventured to the ends of the earth and the innards of the spirit. Conquerors of desires and masters of mind, India's ascetics would birth new conceptions of self, soul, and society. From the time of the most ancient of the Vedas, Indians observed men who didn't really make sense. Most of history is viewed through the dynamics of power or ego or greed, but these men, these people, they gave it all up. They gave up possessions, family inheritance, family prestige, and all material goods. They fundamentally rejected things that made humans humans in the first place. They went into something beyond. He with the long loose locks supports Agni, the moisture, heaven, and earth. He is all sky to look upon. He with long hair is called this light. The Munis, girdled with the wind, wear garments of soil hue. They, following the wind's swift course, go where the gods have gone before. The stillness and silence of the emblematic Indian monk betray how this great spirit invigorated the subcontinent. From silent seals of the Indus to poetic praise in the Vedas, the sadhu has been a cornerstone for Indian society. But beyond their iconic mysticism that has mesmerized men for millennia, I want to focus on an unlikely link in early India. This is the end of the age of the Upanishads, the culmination of the Vedic canon. And like cannon fire against the walls, the Upanishads would set off a series of intellectual revolutions that would upend as well as give new life to traditions. Ascetics play an outsized role in Indian history. As I told you before, they're kind of weird when you look at, humanity itself or how history and society works. They don't really conform to rational or economic ideas of people's behavior. And ascetics have been everywhere in world history, more or less, but in India they play a very special role. India's always had an emphasis on renunciation. But one thing that really supercharges asceticism is actually cities. And you probably wouldn't think of this link, at least I didn't. It doesn't really make sense. But this is kind of like India itself. A lot of things don't really make sense until you dig deeper into it. The most classic representative of Indian ascetics is usually some monks or some hermits who are wandering in the wilderness, or say meditating in the mountains, or maybe in rural lands at best, like going through villages and stuff. But again, this is going to be a tale about cities. And as we go on, you'll start to understand this unlikely link. From around the 6th century BC, the soil of the Gangetic Plain grew heavier. The great forests shrank and were replaced with humans, their animals, and their settlements. The wood that stood witness to the meditation of yogis was refashioned into walls, giving shape to a new phase of the Indian story. The primary cause of this explosion seems to be rice. While the western crescent of the Indo-Gangetic Plain was earlier urbanized, the eastern reaches of the Ganga remain kind of like a dark forest. Post the collapse of the Indus Valley civilization, many migrants actually went east. Now, considering these eastern wetlands are very good for yielding rice, and rice is fairly efficient when it comes to feeding people, especially with something reliable like a monsoon or very wet environments, a population explosion actually happened in this eastern half of the Gangetic Plain. Now, this area would become the main setting for this story or tale of India. This period is popularly known as India's second urbanization. Why do I say second? Where is the first? Well, as I told you before, we have to go to the Indus Valley civilization. Cities like Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, and various other cities. Ruralism gave way to urbanism in India. And naturally, a huge socio-political change also happened. Organization on a scale not seen in centuries would come back. When it came to politics, society, or economics, everything started to become more and more centralized. Chiefs became kings, villages became cities, agriculture became markets. Power began to accumulate in the hands of these great kings, and desire grew in their hearts. Proper states started to form, and now these city-states of the Mahajanapads, they started to become something else. Their logical conclusion, empires. One fascinating aspect of these cities is they weren't actually that new. Now, there was definitely a period of calamity and maybe like ruralism between the Indus Valley civilization and these Mahajanapads, but we do see some kinds of continuity. Particularly, we see parallels when it comes to grid or city planning, kind of the layout of the city, complex drainage systems, and even sometimes the weight and measurement systems between these cities. It seems like someone or some group of people preserve this type of knowledge. With towns becoming more complex as they became cities, so did society. It became more and more hierarchical, and paradoxically, also kind of individualistic. Some of this was related to caste. Cities offered a kind of social dynamism and churn that a lot of these rural villages where caste really prospered, they didn't as much. That was a much more stable environment. Cities, that's where the action happens, and that's where things change. Within these metropolitan cauldrons of change, kingship, asceticism, and mercantilism provided the three biggest outlets for this newborn Indian individualism. With power and arms, one became a king. With enterprise and wealth, one became a merchant. With penance and wisdom, one became an ascetic. Old village structures could not resist the tip of a king's sword, the glint of a merchant's coin, or the wit of an ascetic's word. These three groups kind of played a symbiotic relationship with each other, with kings kind of playing the pivot of all this. They're probably one of the most important players when it comes to this new societal formation. Indian royals would centralize power, which means kind of a need for more complex bureaucracies, as well as governance. Naturally, this meant more interfacing with their subjects, which would mean more road, more taxes, more knowledge coming in, so more complex ways needed to organize this type of knowledge. Merchants and mendicants would now be able to travel between cities and areas much easier with these new roads, ultimately gathering in cities to trade goods as well as gods. Just as new political institutions emerged, so did they manifest as guilds or shranis for merchants and monasteries for monks. Indian history is super politicized, and it kind of always has been. One thing you'll often see is this notion of adversarialism or conflict making between groups in India. Now, if you visit India today, as well as if you visited it like 2,000 years ago or like, I don't know, 3,000 years ago or more, you would notice that there is a lot of syncretism in India. People have different identities, people still kind of get along well, there's pluralism, there's tolerance, and this is a very unique part of India. At least in the ancient world, when it came to these dharmic faiths, we had a lot of coexistence, we had a lot of knowledge sharing, we had a lot of open debates that didn't really get that violent or anything. This was a unique time in India. India's syncretism prevailed. But what you'll see a lot of Indologists or these historians do is kind of make it that, like, I don't know, Hinduism and Buddhism are like in this perennial war together, kind of like Protestants and Catholics or Shias and Sunnis, but that just wasn't the case. This is a huge projection due to a lot of Western ideas of religion and culture and society, and it is definitely a misconception. Sramanism is both an inheritor as well as a parallel strand of Dharma when it comes to the Vedas. There's differences, but there's a lot of similarities, especially when it comes to asceticism. While we could of course see ascetic forerunners in the earliest of Vedas, as well as especially in the Upanishads, other texts also reveal this kind of parentage between the Vedic canon as well as Sramanism in the classical age of India. Panini's 5th century BC Ashtadhyay references lost ascetic manuals called the Bhikshu Shastras. Lord Buddha would later call his own monks as bhikshus, who framed their lives around earlier renunciate traditions, as well as even Brahmins. If you read the Dhammapada itself, as well as a lot of Pali Canon literature, you could see that while Lord Buddha probably did have some conflict with the Brahmins at the time, he really idolized this type of Brahmin life, the asceticism of a true Brahmin. And again, if you read the Dhammapada, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about, with a whole chapter dedicated to that. Earlier Hindu ascetic strands, like Kapil's Samkhya philosophy, had an emphasis on dukkha or suffering, as well as various other ascetic parallels to Sramanism. But what separates Sramanism from Vedic asceticism is systemization, and a very successful systemization of asceticism. Sure, the Bhikshu Shastras and maybe some earlier other manuals had kind of guidelines for ascetics, but with the advent of the Sanghas, or these institutional ascetic bodies and monasteries, that is what really changed asceticism in India. But even before these complex kind of institutional bodies, I think there's another even more simpler thing that Sramanism did, especially Buddhism. Buddhism numbered numbered morality and philosophy. Now that sounds super simple, like, okay, obviously, duh, you know, right? Like the 3 marks of existence, the 4 noble truths, the 5 precepts, the noble eightfold path. Yeah, okay, you know, you have numbers to it. What really matters? But numbers are systemization. Numbers add a sense of memory and kind of finality to things. Simply the attachment of number to philosophic or moral codes were elegant innovations of the Indian mind. So deceptively simple, but the impact of this simplicity reverberated from underneath a sacred fig tree in Bihar to all of Asia. A template was born, which ultimately culminated with the Sangha and monastic institutions, just in time for the cities that were big enough to house them. Kingdoms can come and go, and even sometimes people, but institutions are something else. They could stay and spread beyond both of those. Monasteries, like the cities they were in, became kind of like incubators, especially cultural incubators. Around 86% of the composers of a section of the Pali Canon actually come from cities. The courts of kings were great places for scholars to debate and new ideas to be born. Many of these monasteries would double as universities. Knowledge and ideas would be born and kept in these monasteries and universities, which would periodically send out these monks or bhikshus all across India and spread the teachings, and then eventually return with new things they learned. So you kind of see how these monasteries are like a heart or a brain. They cultivate things inside them, and they send out nerve signals or blood, which eventually return. And there's this whole organic process here when it comes to this institution of a monastery. But particularly important was that these monasteries were centers of a cosmopolitan India. People from all over India would come into these monasteries and universities and exchange ideas and then spread back out. So in this way, you kind of see this creation of a cosmopolitan idea of India, or a united India, or common Indian culture going across the land. Now this is a pattern. This is actually a rhyme of history, one that is repeating its stanza today. For India's second urbanization gives us clues into the one that's happening in the 21st century. The village is a land of nostalgia for so many Indians. As the modern Indian state was born, India was pretty much a village republic. Only 17.3% of Indians lived in urban areas by 1951, just a few years after independence. Now, India's independence leaders had contrasting views of the city versus the village, and this kind of dichotomy, if you haven't noticed, it's kind of like a continuing theme across all of Indian history. Mahatma Gandhi loved the nostalgia of the Indian village, almost to an irrational degree. He was very wary of industrialization and wanted a super decentralized governance structure with villages having a lot of autonomy. Meanwhile, leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru and B.R. Ambedkar, they kind of loathed the villages. They saw cruelty and superstition within these villages and saw the future of India within cities. Lastly, we have Sardar Patel, who kind of met all sides in the middle, and this is kind of characteristic of him being very pragmatic. He thought there needed to be a balanced approach to growth within rural India as well as urban India, agriculture and industry. Today, approximately 37% of India is urbanized. By 2030, it's projected to be around 40% and 50% by 2050. Like India in the age of Buddha and Mahavir, this means society is changing profoundly. The first and most obvious concern is the role of caste in Indian society. Now, caste is probably always going to be a thing in India, especially because there's state-linked incentives to it, as well as a lot of bottom-up pressure too. This is an organic feature of Indian society, and it's hard to go away from it. A lot of people are very attached to their caste. But as India's second urbanization saw, rural caste kinship gave way to urban capital creation. Instead of social life centering around caste duties, goals of production became more important. This is exponentially true in modernity. We already see this manifest in voting patterns and societal trends, as caste-based rhetoric, caste-based political parties, and cultural trends around caste become a lot less sticky around cities. Caste will probably start to become less and less of a factor in India as time goes on, but I don't think it's going to forever go away. From here, though, we flow to religion, as a lot of Hindus today have religious links to their caste. Their traditions are dependent on their caste, or their festivals may be dependent on their caste. But as caste evaporates in the heat of the concrete, what will fill this vessel of belief? We're probably going to see some type of new urban religion come out, like Sramanism in ancient India. And already we kind of see this happening today. There is kind of like an urban Indian religion in a way, whether that's like hustling and bustling, kind of anglicized Indians who go towards meditation retreats or kind of self-help stuff or self-realization things in a bid to kind of return to their roots. Others go towards more like a bhakti focused path, which is more congregational devotion. But the big point is a lot of this is shorn from caste or even ancestral traditions. These are faiths you almost kind of convert into or start following independently. There's an individualism about them when you go into them, but once you're in, it's a new community. And a lot of these new faith organizations or sects or sampradayas, they mirror these monasteries of the past when it comes to Sramanism. They usually have a vanguard of monks or volunteers. And again, like earlier monasteries, becoming a monk is a very tough endeavor. There's a lot of disciplines you need to follow, and there's a lot of big rules for entry. You can't just become a monk if your life kind of sucks and you just want to do something else. You need to be actively giving up something. So a lot of these monks are very educated or come from a background that might be a bit more affluent. So as I said, this really is like a vanguard. Now, if you studied Marxism, you kind of know where I'm getting at here, of this vanguard class of people who may be a bit more well off or educated or have certain tools of power to help the masses. Now, this kind of presents a pickle for traditional Hinduism, especially caste-based groups or groups in rural India, or even maybe storied in traditional sampradayas. They're probably still going to persist, and they have a lot of cultural capital to them, as well as knowledge and tradition. But this is an era of churn, and this is an era where I think more extroverted groups will find a bit more success. The good news is this era is rhyming with the past, so we're going to see similar dynamics. Urban Sramanism and rural Vedicism, they combine to create almost like a composite Hinduism or Bhagavatism, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, whatever you want to call it, but we see these new kinds of faiths where you have attributes of the rural religion as well as the urban religion to create something brand new. But that comes from both. So I think a lot of traditional Hinduism and a lot of these traditional faiths, whatever it is in India, they will kind of rain down in the future, or they will be linked to the past. There's going to be some elements of preservation. But at the end of the day, I don't think anyone can say what the future of religion is in India, especially when it comes to Hinduism or Dharma. Your guess is as good as mine. India has been centralizing a lot in the past 10 years and even prior. So now we're starting to see kind of like a snapback when it comes to caste and regionalism. People are asserting those identities a lot more because they feel like those identities are getting marginalized, or they're getting swallowed, or, consumed in this great churn or mix of Indian civilization and this nation. You're even seeing this phenomenon when it comes to language, where a lot of regionalists really hate Hindi, but you start to see these mix of languages when it comes to Tamil in English, or Gujarati in English, Marathi in English, Bengali in English, all these languages that are starting to naturally mix. And of course, the big one, Hinglish. In almost all of India's metropolitan areas, Hinglish is the lingua franca, especially of new upwardly mobile people coming from the lower or middle classes into this upper middle class or rich class. Over time, we're going to see more and more pressure exerted onto these regional identities or caste identities or whatever these smaller identities, and bigger Indian identities are going to swallow them if they're not preserved properly. Lastly, though, is an X factor, and this is very different than the second urbanization. This aspect was not there in the past. With the advent of English, so comes ideas from the Anglosphere. India has the highest English-speaking population in the world, and it's only growing. Western ideas are and will continue to flood India, and the word of the West is extremely potent when it comes to ideas around individualism. And like I said, now that India is urbanizing rapidly, we're going to see more and more people become more individualistic and possibly away from their community identity. And what society promotes individualism the most? Of course, it's the West. This actually happened in the past as well. Will Durant, an American historian, noted the interesting effect of Indian students who went to England for school. In 1923, there were 1,094 Hindu students enrolled in the schools of England. They marveled at the privileges enjoyed by the lowliest citizens of Europe and America. They studied the French and American revolutions and read the liberal literature of reform, the radical literature of revolt. They gloated over the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the Declaration of Independence, and the American Constitution. They went back to their countries as centers of infection for democratic ideas and the gospel of liberty. So as you see here, urbanized and westernized Indians, they're kind of centers for infection, I guess, as Will Durant put, when it comes to ideas. These ideas are just going to keep spreading as this content and this culture comes out from the West into India. Ironically, many of the provincial identities that do battle with central identities of India, especially when it comes to, say, Hindutva versus caste or Jatitva or regional identities that we kind of see in modern Indian politics, well, these provincial identities, I think they're going to eventually make up when it comes to these central Indian ideas. That is because India is about to face a tsunami of westernization in certain parts, at least, especially the cities. Now, this is, I think, really long term, and even then, I don't think there's going to be a total westernization of these Indians. I think it's going to be a certain class, maybe, but this group will probably mix with current elements in India today. So everything, again, is in flux. We'll see what happens in the far future. But India's next avatar will definitely have some Western aspects to it. It's up to the citizens in their own way, and I hope it's the good parts, because there are a lot of bad parts. There's definitely a lot of good parts, but there's some bad parts. Conversely, India will also have its own impact on the West. Indian opinions have started to trickle into the West, and will soon form their own fierce river to carve discourse in the Anglosphere. Again, it's kind of a two-way road here. If the most English speakers are in India, obviously there's going to be a lot of interaction between the rest of the English world and India, and there's going to be some Indianization maybe even on the other side. Ultimately, as we stand on the edge of India's next great transformation, one thing is clear. While we may recognize echoes of the past and the present, the future remains an open scroll. The ink that will fill the pages will be drawn from tradition, innovation, struggle, and aspiration. The ancient ascetics clad in the elements, and urban youths of today, striving for meaning amid glass and concrete, are part of that same endless search for purpose, one that will continue to define the spirit of India, no matter how many scripts history may write. Thanks again for watching, everyone. This is Akshar from the Emissary. I'm going to start a Patreon soon if I already haven't at this point. Just check the link in the description below. I've been writing about India for around 5 years, and I've written a lot of articles about it. I've written a lot of Twitter threads about it, and in this past year, I started doing videos. So if you want to support my mission here and hopefully get this thing going and make it even bigger, because that's definitely something I want to do consider supporting me via Patreon. Or if you want to do something a little extra, slide in my DMs or something and we'll talk about it. As always, like, share, subscribe, follow, comment, do everything you can to boost this algo, and let's get it going. Once again, this is Akshar from the Emissary. Have a good one.